The air in the plaza was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and endings. It clung to the back of Alara's throat, a taste like rust and humiliation. The auctioneer's voice was a hammer, each word a nail, driving her further into the wood of the viewing platform. She was property, a line item in a failed man's ledger. A strong back, good hips for birthing, and she can cook, I'm told. The broker, a man named Finch with a stained collar and greedy eyes, announced to the small, smirking crowd. He did not look at her. He looked past her at the men gathered below, men who had known her since she was a girl, men who had seen her father's pride slowly curdle into desperation. Her father stood near the edge of the crowd, his shoulders slumped, his hat held in his hands. He was studying a crack in the dry-packed earth at his feet, as if it held the answers to the universe. He would not meet her eyes. That was the sharpest cut of all. Laughter, low and cruel, rippled through the onlookers. It was not the boisterous laughter of a good joke, but the snickering of jackals circling a wounded thing. Alara stood straight. She forced her chin up. Her hands, callous from a life of labor her father had just erased with a few pathetic words, were clenched into fists at her sides. She was 24 years old. She was not a mare to be sold. She was not a sack of grain to be bartered. She's quiet, too, Finch added, misinterpreting her stillness for docility. Obedient. Something inside her, a cord stretched taut for years, finally snapped. I'm not quiet, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring and the heat. It was clear and cold as well water. Every head turned. Finch's smile faltered. He glanced at her, irritation flickering in his eyes. He had sold her silence, and she had just proved him a liar. I am not quiet, she repeated, her gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd, landing for a searing moment on her father's bowed head. I have simply had nothing to say to any of you. She saw shock. She saw annoyance. She saw, in a few of the women's faces, a flicker of something that might have been pity or perhaps recognition. And I am not for sale, she said, the words tasting like freedom and folly all at once. A man in the front row laughed out loud. A bit late for that, girl. The papers are signed. The words struck her, but she did not flinch. She had spoken. That was the thing. She had taken back her own voice, if only for a moment. Finch, recovering, stepped toward her. That's enough out of you. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in her flesh like dull talons. The transaction was over. The performance was done. She was to be silent again. He pulled her from the platform, down the rough-hewn steps, and toward a wagon hitched at the edge of the plaza. He was muttering about the trouble with headstrong women, about how her price had likely just dropped. She did not resist. The fire had burned out, leaving only cold ash. She had lost. She had lost the moment her father decided a daughter was worth less than a few bad debts. As Finch shoved her toward the wagon, she stumbled, catching herself against its splintered side. She looked back one last time. Her father had finally lifted his head. His face was a mask of shame, his eyes wet. He looked broken. She felt nothing for him. Not love, not hate, just a vast, hollow emptiness where a daughter's heart should have been. She turned away. Finch left her by the wagon, telling her not to move, and went back to collect his payment. She was alone. The crowd was dispersing, their moment of sordid entertainment over. They went back to their lives, to their families, leaving her in the shrinking patch of shade by the wagon. She slid down the rough planks of the wagon bed, her back pressed against the wood, until she was sitting in the dust. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, making herself small. The world had become a narrow, tight space. Then the tears came. They were not the soft tears of sorrow. They were hot, ragged, silent things that tore their way up from a place deep inside her that had been locked for years. Each sob was a memory, a dismissive word, a passed-over glance, the constant, grinding weight of being deemed insufficient. She cried for the girl she had been, the one who believed in her father's strength. She cried for the woman she was, sold and shamed in the sun-bleached plaza of the only home she had ever known. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen, and there was nothing left inside but a hard, cold knot of resolve. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing dust and tears across her skin. She looked at her hands. They were strong hands, capable hands. They knew how to mend a fence, pull a calf, balance a ledger, and make a garden grow from stubborn soil. They were not the hands of a decorative thing. They were the hands of a survivor. And she would survive this. In the dusty alley of her own despair, she made a vow. Never again. Never again would she trust her fate to another. Never again would she depend on the flimsy promises of men. Not fathers, not brokers, not husbands. Her worth was not in their eyes. It was in her own two hands. She would rely on herself. Only herself. She would build a wall around her heart so high and so thick that no one could ever breach it again. She would be her own fortress. The shadow of a man fell over her. She looked up. Her eyes narrowed, the tears instantly dry. Her body tensed, ready for the next blow, the next command. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the simple, functional clothes of a working rancher. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see a square jaw and a mouth set in a firm, unsmiling line. He was weathered, not polished, a product of sun and wind. He did not look at her the way the other men had. His gaze was not hungry or mocking. It was assessing, the way a man looks at a fence that needs mending or a sky that threatens rain. It was a gaze that calculated what was required, without immediate judgment. "You are Alara?" he asked. His voice was low and steady, a rumble that seemed to come from his chest. She did not answer. She just stared at him, her silence a shield. He took a half step back, as if sensing he was crowding her. He removed his hat. His hair was dark, streaked with gray at the temples, his face lined with the hard work of years. His eyes were the color of faded denim. "I am Silas. Silas Croft." He waited. The silence stretched. "Finch said you were purchased from my ranch," Alara said finally, her voice flat and hard. She put the ugliest word she could think of between them, a test. Silas's expression did not change. "He is a liar and a fool." The simple, declarative statement caught her off guard. It was not what she expected. "I paid your father's debt," Silas continued, his gaze direct and unwavering. "I did not buy you. I have no use for purchased people." Finch came bustling back then, his face slick with sweat and satisfaction. He held a small leather pouch. "All settled, Croft," he said, his tone oily. "She's all yours. A bit stubborn, as you saw, but a firm hand will sort that." Silas turned his head slowly to look at Finch. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. "Get away from my wagon, Finch." The broker's smile vanished. He opened his mouth to protest, saw the look in Silas's eyes, and thought better of it. He scurried away without another word, clutching his pouch. Silas turned back to Alara. He gestured to the wagon. "The journey is long. We should start before the heat gets worse." She remained seated in the dust. Suspicion was a living thing inside her, coiling in her gut. This was a trick, a different kind of trap. "Why?" she asked, the single word sharp as a shard of glass. "Why pay a debt for a stranger?" Silas considered the question for a long moment. He put his hat back on, adjusting the brim. "I knew your grandfather," he said. "He was an honest man, and I was in town for supplies. I saw what was happening. It was wrong. It was too simple, too decent." She did not believe it. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice rising. "I have nothing. They took it all. I want nothing from you that you do not choose to give," he said, his tone still maddeningly calm. "My ranch needs a cook, a real one. The men are tired of my own efforts. I will pay you a fair wage. You will have your own room. The door has a lock. You will have the key. You are free to leave at any time. Walk away tomorrow if you see fit. I will not stop you." She stared at him, searching his face for the lie, the hidden hook in his offer. She found only a deep-seated weariness and a steady, implacable honesty. "I don't trust you," she said, the words of her vow still fresh on her soul. "I'm not asking you to," he replied. He did not seem offended. "I am asking you to get in the wagon. Judge me by my actions, not my words. Or his. He nodded in the direction Finch had fled. He held out a hand to help her up. It was a large, calloused hand like her own, a working man's hand. She ignored it. Using the wagon wheel for leverage, she pushed herself to her feet. She stood before him, covered in dust, her eyes swollen, her dress rumpled, and met his gaze. "Wages," she said, testing the word. "Wages," he confirmed. "My own room, with a lock, and the key is yours alone. And I can leave, whenever you wish." It was a cage with an open door, but a cage nonetheless. Still, it was better than the one she had just escaped. It was the only offer she had. Slowly, deliberately, she walked to the back of the wagon and climbed in. She did not look at him. She settled herself against a stack of flour sacks, pulling her small, pathetic bundle of belongings into her lap. He did not say another word. He simply walked to the front, climbed onto the driver's seat, and clicked the reins. The wagon lurched forward, pulling her away from the town, away from her old life, away from the smoldering ruins of her trust. They rode in silence for hours. The sun beat down relentless. The landscape shifted from the dusty confines of the town to a wide, open country of rolling hills and sparse, hardy trees. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the plodding of the horses, and the vast, humming silence of the plains. Alara did not speak. She watched the land go by, her mind a turmoil of doubt and fear. She replayed the scene in the plaza, the auctioneer's words, her father's face. She felt the burn of shame, the cold fire of her vow. This man, Silas, was a puzzle. His quiet respect was more unnerving than Finch's open contempt. Contempt she understood. Contempt she was used to. This quiet consideration felt like a language she did not speak. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple, he finally pulled the wagon to a halt near a small, clear-running creek. "We'll rest the horses," he said, climbing down. She stayed in the wagon, watching him. He unhitched the team and led them to the water, his movements unhurried and efficient. He spoke to the animals in a low, soothing voice. He did not seem to be aware of her gaze. Or if he was, he did not care. When the horses were tended to, he walked back to the wagon. He reached behind the seat and pulled out a wrapped bundle. He looked up at her. "Are you hungry?" The question was so simple, so direct. It was not a command. It was not an observation about her size or her appetite. It was a simple, human question. And she was starving. She had not eaten since the morning, her stomach a tight, aching knot of anxiety. The shame of her own hunger rose in her throat. In her father's house, her appetite had always been a source of comment, another mark of her unladylike largeness. She could not bring herself to answer. She just stared at him. He seemed to understand. He did not press. He simply unwrapped the bundle. It contained a loaf of dark bread and a thick wedge of cheese. He took out a knife, cut a generous portion of each, and laid them on the cloth. Then he walked over to the creek and busied himself checking the horse's tack, his back to her. He was giving her privacy. The thought was so unexpected it felt like a physical blow. The privacy to eat, without judgment, without comment. A lump formed in her throat, thick and painful. It was the first act of non-transactional kindness she had received in years. It was not a payment, not a trade. It was just food, offered. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bread and cheese. She ate quickly, mechanically at first, then more slowly as the sharp edges of her hunger began to soften. The bread was hearty, the cheese sharp. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. When she was finished, she carefully wrapped the remaining food and placed it back in the wagon. Silas eventually wandered back, acting as if nothing had happened. He cut his own portion of bread and cheese and ate standing by the wagon wheel, looking out at the fading light. He did not mention her eating. He did not look to see how much was gone. He just ate his supper. When he was done, he hitched the horses back to the wagon. "Not much further," he said. She nodded, her throat still too tight for words. The wall she had built around her heart was still there. It was high and thick, but she could feel a small, hairline crack near its foundation. A crack made by a simple question and a piece of bread. It terrified her. They arrived at the ranch well after dark. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light. What Alara could make out was a collection of dark, solid shapes against the horizon. A long, low ranch house, a massive barn, a scattering of smaller outbuildings and corrals. The air smelled of hay and cattle and pine. Silas led her to the house. The front door opened into a large main room that served as a kitchen, dining room, and living space. A single lantern burned on a long trestle table, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The room was a testament to functional neglect. Dirty plates were stacked by a stone sink. Boots were kicked off in a corner. A saddle, in need of mending, was slung over a chair. It was not filthy, but it was deeply disorganized. The space of a man, or men, who were too tired or too overwhelmed to care about order. An older man with a face like a weathered map and a fringe of white hair looked up from the table as they entered. He had been cleaning a rifle. "Jeb," Silas said, "this is Alara. She'll be handling the cooking." Jeb's eyes, shrewd and pale blue, flickered over Alara. It was a quick, comprehensive glance. He took in her dusty dress, her swollen eyes, the defiant set of her jaw. He grunted. It was a sound that conveyed neither welcome nor hostility. It was simply an acknowledgement. "Room's ready," Jeb said, his voice a gravelly rasp. He nodded toward a closed door at the far end of the room. Silas picked up the lantern. "I'll show you." He led her to the door and opened it. The room was small and spare, containing a narrow bed with a patched quilt, a small wooden crate for a table, and a hook on the wall. It was monastic in its simplicity, but it was clean. The floor was swept, the quilt was neatly folded, and a pitcher of water and a basin sat on the crate. Jeb had done this. "It's not much," Silas said from the doorway. "It's enough," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He held out a heavy iron key. "The lock is on the inside." She took it. The metal was cold and solid in her palm. A promise. She curled her fingers around it, the sharp edges digging into her skin. "The men eat at sunrise and sunset," he said. "There are 40 hands on this ranch. The pantry is through there." He pointed to another door in the main room. "Take what you need. If we don't have it, write it on the slate by the door." He paused, as if there was more to say, but he just nodded. "Rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." He pulled the door closed, leaving her in the lantern light. She stood in the middle of the small room for a long time, just holding the key. Then she walked to the door and slid the heavy bolt home. She heard the solid, satisfying thud as it settled into place. She was locked in. She was safe. The contradiction was not lost on her. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress rustling with the sound of straw. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was in a space that was hers alone. No one could enter without her permission. She had a room. She had a key. She had a wage, or the promise of one. It was more than she had possessed that morning. She did not undress. She lay down on top of the quilt, still in her dusty clothes, and pulled the rough fabric up to her chin. The fortress around her heart remained, but for the first time, she felt as though she was on the inside of its walls, looking out rather than on the outside, looking in. Sleep did not come easily, but when it did, it was deep and dreamless. She woke before dawn. A lifetime of habit had her on her feet while the sky was still a bruised purple. She moved quietly in the small room, washing her face in the cold water from the pitcher. She smoothed her dress as best she could and braided her hair into a single, thick plait down her back. She unlocked her door and stepped into the main room. It was empty, the fire in the hearth reduced to glowing embers. She went to work. It was her native language, the creation of order from chaos. She did not do it for praise or for thanks. She did it because the disorder of the room was a physical irritant, a problem that needed solving. She stoked the fire, adding wood until it blazed, warming the chill from the room. She put a massive kettle of water on a boil. She found the pantry, a large, cool space stocked with sacks of flour, beans, potatoes, and slabs of salt pork. It was well-stocked but messy, things shoved onto shelves without thought. She began to organize, her mind clicking into a familiar, comforting rhythm. She found coffee and started a pot brewing in a giant tin percolator, the size of which told her everything she needed to know about the scale of her task. 40 men. The number was daunting. She found flour, lard, salt. Her hands moved with an economy and skill born of endless repetition. She made biscuits, dozens of them, lining them up on huge baking sheets. She sliced the salt pork and set it to fry in cast-iron pans as wide as wagon wheels. The smells of coffee, bacon, and baking bread began to fill the house. Men started to drift in one by one, then in small groups. They were young and old, lean and weathered. They moved with the quiet competence of men who worked hard and spoke little. They stopped just inside the door, surprised by the warmth, the light, the smells. They looked at her, then at the organized kitchen, then back at her. No one spoke to her directly. They just found places at the long table, their movements suddenly more careful, less clumsy. Jeb was the last to enter, followed by Silas. Jeb stopped and sniffed the air. He looked at the neat stacks of plates, the simmering pot of gravy she had made, the mountains of biscuits. He looked at Alara, who was calmly turning bacon. He grunted. This time, the sound was different. It held a note of grudging approval. It was the highest praise she could have imagined from him. Silas stood in the doorway, watching her. His assessing gaze was back, but it was softer now. He was not looking at a problem to be solved. He was looking at a solution in motion. Breakfast was a quiet, serious affair. The men ate with a focused intensity. They ate the mountain of biscuits. They emptied the frying pans. They drank gallons of coffee. When they were finished, each man brought his plate to the sink, scraped it clean into a bucket she had set out, and placed it in the hot, soapy water she had prepared. No one had told them to. They just did it. It was a silent, collective acknowledgement of her labor. As the last man filed out into the dawn, Jeb paused by the stove. Biscuits were good, he said, not looking at her. He then walked out the door. Alara felt a strange flutter in her chest. It was absurd, a two-word compliment from a gruff old man. But it felt more real, more earned, than any praise her father had ever given her. Silas was the only one left in the room. He was leaning against the doorframe, a mug of coffee in his hands. Supper was good, he said. She looked at him, confused. That was breakfast. The bread and cheese last night, he clarified. That was supper. It was good. She turned back to the sink, her cheeks suddenly hot. She did not know what to say. He was thanking her for eating the food he had given her. The logic of it was alien. She scrubbed a pan with unnecessary force. He was a danger. His quiet decency was a far greater threat to her walls than any man's cruelty had ever been. The days settled into a rhythm. Alara cooked. She cleaned. She brought order to the house, then to the vegetable garden behind it, which had been left to go to weed. She worked from before sunrise until after sunset. The labor was hard, but it was honest. It was hers. Section. She spoke little. The men, in turn, spoke little to her. But a language of mutual respect began to form. They kept their boots clean of mud before entering the house. They spoke more quietly at the table. They started leaving small offerings on the porch for her. A handful of wild berries, a string of fish from the creek, a strangely beautiful hawk's feather. She was a part of the ranch's ecosystem now, a vital part. But she saw the worry in Silas's eyes. She saw it in the way he stared at the horizon, in the tense lines around his mouth during the quiet evenings. The ranch was struggling. The grass in the pastures was thin and brown. The creek that fed their land was running low, a mere trickle of its usual self. The cattle were lean, their ribs showing. It was a dry year, the driest in memory. One evening, a week after her arrival, the problem came to a head. Silas, Jeb, and two senior hands were poring over old maps on the main table. Their faces were grim. The blockage is somewhere up in the high country. One of the hands, a man named Tom, said. The main irrigation ditch is bone dry from the fork onwards. We've walked the line for miles. Can't find the source. It has to be a rock slide, Jeb growled, or a beaver dam the size of a house. We've looked, Silas said, his voice heavy with frustration. He ran a hand through his hair. It's like the water just vanishes. Without that water, the lower pastures would turn to dust. They would have to sell off half the herd at a loss. It would be a catastrophic blow. Alara was at the far end of the table, mending a shirt. She had been listening quietly. She was an observer by nature. She saw patterns others missed. She had seen these maps before. Silas kept them in a tin tube by the hearth. Out of curiosity, she had studied them one afternoon, tracing the lines of rivers and property boundaries, the topography of the land that was now her home. She remembered something, a detail that seemed insignificant. She hesitated. It was not her place. She was the cook. Her domain was the kitchen, the house. But she saw the despair on Silas's face, and she remembered his words, "Judge me by my actions." Her actions had been confined to the domestic sphere. But her mind saw more than flour and salt. "The survey is wrong," she said, her voice quiet. The four men at the table fell silent and turned to look at her. She felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. She had overstepped. "What did you say?" Silas asked, his voice even. He was not angry. He was curious. She stood and walked to the table, her heart pounding. She pointed a finger at a spot on the map, high up in the hills. "Here, the original survey from 30 years ago. It marks this area as solid granite." Jeb squinted at the map. "It is. Always has been." "No," Alara said, her confidence growing as she spoke the language of logic. "It's not. I saw it on the ride here. There's a line of shale and limestone running through that ridge. You can see the different color in the rock from a distance. The survey was done in a wet season. They probably couldn't see the rock face for the vegetation." She took a deep breath. Water doesn't flow over limestone. It flows through it. The creek isn't blocked. It's been diverted. It's running underground, probably following that shale seam. The men stared at her, then at the map. "An underground river?" Tom said, skeptical. "It's possible," Silas murmured, his eyes fixed on the spot Alara had indicated. He was looking at her differently now. The assessing gaze was back, but this time it was filled with something like awe. "If the water is going underground here," she continued, tracing a line with her finger, "based on the geology, it should resurface. Probably. Here," she pointed to a shallow, dry basin about 2 miles south of their property line. In the basin on the Thorne property, a heavy silence fell over the room. Marcus Thorne was their neighbor, the polished, wealthy rancher who was always offering Silas his help. "If you were to blast here," she said, her finger returning to the limestone ridge at the intake point, "you could collapse the sinkhole, force the water back into its original channel." Jeb stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He slowly closed it and let out a single, explosive syllable. "Huh." It was a symphony of impressed surprise. Silas looked up from the map. He looked directly at her, and for the first time, she felt he was not just seeing a cook or a woman he had saved. He was seeing her, her mind. "What else can you do?" he asked, the question soft but immense. They rode out at dawn the next day. Silas, Jeb, and Alara. She had not expected to be included, but Silas had insisted. "You saw it. You should see it through." She rode a steady, placid mare, feeling out of place and yet exactly where she was supposed to be. They carried dynamite and tools. She led them to the ridge she had spotted from the wagon, and she was right. A clear, visible seam of crumbling limestone and shale cut through the granite, almost exactly where she had predicted. And at its base, hidden by a thicket of overgrown brush, was a sinkhole. The creek flowed into it and disappeared with a faint, gurgling sound. Jeb just stood there, shaking his head slowly. "I've ridden this trail 100 times. 100 times. They set the charges." Silas and Jeb, with their years of experience, worked with a quiet efficiency. But they consulted her on the placement on the angle. They treated her not as a woman, but as an expert, a geologist. They took cover, and Silas lit the fuse. The explosion was a deafening roar that echoed through the hills. Rock and dust flew into the air. When the dust settled, they approached cautiously. The sinkhole had collapsed. A massive pile of rubble now plugged the earth's throat, and the creek, denied its underground path, began to swell. It pooled against the new dam of rock and dirt. Then, finding the path of least resistance, it surged back into the dry, waiting bed of the irrigation ditch. Water. Life. They watched it, mesmerized, as the silver ribbon flowed away from them, down toward the thirsty pastures of the Croft Ranch. Silas looked at Alara. There was no smile on his face. There was something better, a deep, profound respect. "You saved us," he said. It was a simple fact. She just shook her head, unable to speak. She had not done it to be his savior. She had done it because the problem was there, and she had seen the solution. It was that simple. That evening, the atmosphere in the ranch house was transformed. Hope had returned. The men's voices were louder, their laughter easier. After the meal, when the room was quiet again, Silas approached her. He placed a heavy, leather-bound ledger on the table in front of her. "You see things people miss," he said, repeating his words from the night before. "I need you to look at this." It was the ranch's financial records. "I'm just a cook," she said, the old insecurity rising up. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You are not." He left her there with the book. She opened it. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, a language she understood as well as she understood flour and water. Her father, for all his failings, had insisted she learn accounting. A woman must know how to manage a household, he'd said. He had never imagined she would use it to dissect the lifeblood of a cattle ranch. For the next 2 days, she worked. When she was not cooking, she was bent over the ledger, a pen in her hand, a frown of concentration on her face. At first, it just looked like bad luck and poor management. Overpayments for feed, lower than expected prices at market, a few cattle lost to predators each season. But Alara was a seeker of patterns. She started a fresh page in the back of the book, making her own notes. The overpayments for feed all went to the same supplier, a company based 2 towns over. A company Silas had said he'd never dealt with directly, that his neighbor handled the orders for him as a favor. The cattle sales at low prices all occurred at a small, remote auction house, not the main stockyards. And the records were incomplete, the head counts always slightly off. The lost cattle, the numbers were too consistent. 3 head in the spring, 5 in the fall. Every year, like a tax. She cross-referenced dates. She made charts, and slowly, a dark and ugly picture began to emerge. It was not bad luck. It was sabotage, a deliberate, systematic bleeding of the ranch, slow and steady, like a wound that would not clot. And one name appeared again and again in the margins, in the notes on freight and delivery, in the records of stray cattle reported and supposedly recovered. Marcus Thorne, the helpful neighbor. She felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. This was not a simple problem of water and rock. This was a man's greed, coiled and patient like a snake in the grass. She sat back, the truth of it stark and undeniable on the page before her. Silas trusted this man. He had mentioned Thorne's help, his advice, 6 times. It was a deep and calculated betrayal. She had to tell him. She found him in the barn, repairing a harness. The smell of leather and linseed oil filled the air. "Silas," she said, her voice tight. He looked up, his hands stilling. He saw the look on her face and immediately set the harness aside. "What is it?" She laid the ledger on a nearby workbench and opened it to her notes. She did not soften the blow. She explained it just as she had the problem with the water, logically, methodically, piece by piece. She showed him the pattern of overpayments, the fraudulent cattle counts, the consistent losses that were too regular to be natural. "It's Thorne," she said at the end, her voice quiet but certain. "He's been robbing you for years, slowly enough that you wouldn't notice. He's been waiting for a bad year, a dry spell, to finish you off." Silas stared at the ledger, his face hardening into a mask of stone. The muscles in his jaw clenched and unclenched. He did not speak for a full minute. The silence in the barn was absolute. "I've known him since we were boys," he said finally, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The betrayal was a fresh, gaping wound. He looked from the ledger to her, his eyes filled with a cold fire. "He offered to buy the note on my loan from the bank last month. Said he wanted to help me out, Give me more flexible terms. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. He wasn't just trying to weaken the ranch. He was positioning himself to seize it. Just as the full weight of the discovery settled between them, they heard the sound of an approaching horse. A voice called out from the yard. "Silas, you in there?" It was a rich, confident voice. A voice used to being obeyed. Silas and Alara exchanged a look of cold understanding. Marcus Thorne had arrived. He appeared in the wide doorway of the barn, a silhouette against the bright afternoon sun. He was everything Silas was not. He was tall and lean, dressed in expensive, tailored riding clothes. His boots were polished to a high gleam. His smile was bright and easy, but did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Silas, my friend," he said, stepping into the barn. "I came to see if you needed any help. I heard you had a bit of an explosion up in the hills. Brought the creek back, I hear. Clever." His gaze slid past Silas and landed on Alara. It lingered, insolent and dismissive. He took in her plain dress, her flour-dusted apron. "Well now," Thorne said, his smile widening into a smirk. "I see you found yourself some new domestic help. I heard Finch had a good day in town last week." The casual, cruel remark hung in the air. He was reminding her of what she was. He was reminding Silas of where he had gotten her. He was asserting his power, his social dominance, with a single, poisoned sentence. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. The shame of the auction, which had begun to recede, came rushing back, hot and suffocating. But before she could retreat, before she could lower her eyes, she saw the look on Silas's face. It was murder. Silas took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. His entire body was coiled like a spring. He looked ready to tear Marcus Thorne apart with his bare hands. "Silas, don't." Alara's voice was sharp, a command. He stopped, turning to look at her. He was confused, his rage momentarily checked. "This is what he wants," she said, her voice low and urgent, for his ears only. She kept her eyes on Thorne, who was watching their exchange with an amused, superior expression. "He wants you to lose your temper. He wants you to throw a punch. He wants you to be a predictable, hot-headed rancher. He will use it against you. He will call you unstable. He will have witnesses." She saw the truth of her words dawn in Silas's eyes. The raw fury began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. He was a smart man. He understood strategy. He took a deep, steadying breath and turned back to Thorne. His face was unreadable. "Thorne," Silas said, his voice level. "Thanks for stopping by. We have it handled." Thorne's smile tightened. This was not the reaction he had expected. He had prodded the bear, and the bear had refused to roar. He looked from Silas's calm face to Alara's steady gaze. He saw the ledger on the workbench between them. He understood. They knew. But he was too arrogant to show it. "Of course you do," Thorne said smoothly. "Just remember, if you ever find yourself in over your head, my offer to help still stands. It was a threat disguised as kindness." "I'll keep that in mind," Silas said. Thorne tipped his hat, his eyes lingering on Alara for another cold, contemptuous moment. "Mom." Then he turned and walked out, his polished boots silent in the dusty straw. They listened to the sound of his horse galloping away. When he was gone, Silas sagged against the workbench, the adrenaline leaving him. He looked at Alara. "He knows we know," Silas said. "Yes," she replied. "Now the real fight begins." "I should have," he started, his fists clenching again. "No," she insisted. "You did the right thing. We don't fight him with fists. We fight him with this." She tapped the ledger. "We fight him with his own greed. We gather evidence. We build a case. We don't let him see us coming until it's too late." He looked at her, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes. He had bought a cook. He had gotten a general. "We?" he asked, his voice quiet. He had noticed her use of the word. "Yes," Alara said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "We." This was her home now. This was her fight. She had chosen it. A slow smile spread across Silas's face. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile. It transformed his weary, weathered features. "All right, General," he said. "What are our orders?" The Cold War began. Under Alara's direction, They started a quiet, meticulous investigation. Silas, using the excuse of the newly flowing water, sent Jeb and a few trusted hands to discreetly survey the southern pastures, mapping out Thorne's property lines and looking for any sign of rebranded Croft cattle. Alara, meanwhile, created a second set of books, a true set. She recorded every expense, every sale, every head of cattle, with painstaking accuracy. She started a correspondence with the bank in the territorial capital, asking for copies of Silas's original loan agreements and Thorne's recent inquiries. They worked in secret after the long days were done, huddled over the table in the main room, the lantern light casting long shadows. An alliance was forged in those late hours, built on whispered strategies and shared cups of coffee. Alara found herself opening up, sharing her knowledge not just of numbers, but of systems. She explained how Thorne would have set up his shell companies, how he would have bribed the minor officials at the remote auction house. She had a mind that saw the hidden architecture of deceit. Silas listened, absorbed. He, in turn, told her about the land, about the cattle, about the history of his family's ranch. He spoke of his father and grandfather, men of integrity who had built this place with their own hands. He was fighting not just for a piece of property, but for a legacy. Thorne, however, was not idle. Sensing he had lost the element of surprise, he escalated his attacks. But he was clever. His weapons were whispers and rumors. The next time Silas went to town for supplies, he was met with cold shoulders and suspicious glances. The talk in the saloon, the gossip at the general store was all about him. They said he was losing his mind, that he was being manipulated by the fat, disgraced woman he'd bought at auction. They said she was a witch, that she had him under her spell. They said she was the reason for his troubles, a curse on his land. The poison was aimed directly at Alara. Thorne knew she was Silas's weakness and his strength. He sought to isolate them, to turn the entire community against them. Silas came back from that trip, his face like a thundercloud. He didn't tell Alara what was said, but she knew. She saw it in the way the younger hands, the ones more susceptible to town gossip, avoided her eyes. Then the attacks became more direct. A section of fence was cut along the northern boundary, and a dozen prime steers wandered off. They were never found. A small, isolated hayrick, far from the main barn, went up in flames one night. It was put out before it could spread, but the message was clear. An accident. A warning. The pressure mounted. The ranch became an island in a sea of hostility. The hands grew tense and quiet. The hope that had bloomed with the returning water began to wither under the heat of Thorne's relentless psychological warfare. And it began to work on Alara. The whispers from town were echoes of her deepest fears, the ones she had carried since childhood. That she was worthless, that she was a burden, that her presence brought ruin. She had come here and brought a war to Silas's doorstep. He had been struggling, yes, but he had been surviving. Now, because of her, because of what she had uncovered, he was facing total destruction. The thought was a constant, gnawing pain. One afternoon, she was in the garden, weeding, her mind a turmoil. Two of the younger hands were repairing a corral nearby, their voices carrying on the wind. "I'm just saying," one of them muttered, "we never had this kind of trouble before she came." "It ain't her fault," the other replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not, but Thorne never pushed this hard before. It's like she's a lightning rod for bad luck. The whole town thinks so." The words struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. She dropped her trowel, her hands suddenly numb. A lightning rod for bad luck. That was it. That was what she was. She was the cause. Her vow, the one she had made in the alley, came back to her. Rely on yourself. Only yourself. She had broken it. She had allowed herself to become part of something, to care about this place, about these people, about Silas. And now she was destroying it. The only way to save the ranch, to save Silas, was to remove the cause of the problem. To remove herself. Her decision was made in that instant, a cold and terrible certainty. That night, she waited until the house was dark and silent. She packed her few belongings into the same small bundle she had arrived with. Her wages, which Silas had insisted on paying her each week, were tucked inside. It was more money than she had ever had. She wrote a short note, leaving it on the kitchen table. I am sorry for the trouble I have brought you. This is for the best. Eh. She did not sign her full name. She was not a person. She was a problem being solved. She slipped out of the house, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She did not look back. She started walking down the long, dark road that led away from the ranch. Each step was an agony. Each step was a betrayal of the hope she had foolishly allowed to grow. But it was necessary. She had not gone more than a mile when she heard him. The sound of a single horse, walking, not running. She froze, her back to the sound. She did not have to turn around. She knew it was him. Silas dismounted. She heard his boots on the dusty road. He stopped a few feet behind her. "Where are you going, Alara?" he asked. His voice was not angry. It was quiet and filled with a pain that cut her deeper than any shout could have. "Away," she said, her own voice thick. "I'm saving you. Saving me." He sounded incredulous. "By leaving? By taking the only good thing that has happened to this ranch in 5 years and walking away with it in the middle of the night?" "I'm a curse," she whispered, the ugly words from town spilling from her lips. "A lightning rod. Everything was fine until I came here." "Fine." He let out a short, harsh laugh. "Fine? This ranch was dying, Alara. It was being bled dry, and I was too blind and too proud to see it. You were the one who opened my eyes. You brought the water back. You found a cancer in my books. You are the only reason we still have a chance to fight." He stepped closer until he was standing right behind her. She could feel the heat of him, the solid presence of him in the darkness. "Do you have any idea what you are worth?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, intense murmur. "Not to Finch, not to your father, to this place, to me." She shook her head, tears blurring the starry sky. "They're saying things in town, about me, about you. And you think I care?" he said fiercely. "I've been in town. I've heard the whispers, and I have set them straight. I told them you are the smartest person on this ranch, and that your counsel is more valuable to me than 100 head of cattle. I told them if they have a problem with you, they have a problem with me." She turned then, stunned. She looked up at his face in the faint moonlight. His expression was raw, his eyes burning with an intensity that stripped away all her defenses. "You defended me?" she whispered. "Of course I defended you," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You are one of us. You are." He stopped, searching for the right word. But he never found it. A frantic shout came from the direction of the ranch. A rider was galloping toward them, a speck of motion against the dark land. "Silas! Fire!" the voice screamed. "The main barn. And Jeb is trapped inside." The world narrowed to that single, horrific announcement. Silas's head snapped up. The raw emotion on his face was instantly replaced by the grim mask of a commander. He grabbed Alara's arm. "There's no time to walk." Without another word, he lifted her as if she weighed nothing and set her on the horse's back. He swung up behind her, his arm a steel band around her waist, and wheeled the horse around. "Hold on," he ordered, and they flew toward the fire. The fire was a living beast. It roared, a monstrous, hungry thing consuming the heart of the ranch. Flames leaped into the night sky, painting the clouds a terrifying, bloody orange. The main barn, the product of a lifetime of labor, was being eaten alive. Panicked cattle crashed against their corral fences, their bellows of terror mixing with the roar of the fire and the shouts of the men. This was not a warning. This was Thorne's final move, his checkmate. Silas slid from the horse before it had even stopped, pulling Alara down with him. The heat was a physical blow, a wall of scorching air. "Get the herd out," Silas bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Cut the far fences. Drive them to the north pasture." The hands, who had been running in panic circles, snapped to attention. They had their orders. They had a purpose. They moved as one, a disciplined unit against the overwhelming chaos. Silas turned to the burning barn. A section of the roof had already collapsed, sending a shower of embers into the sky. The main doors were blocked by fallen, burning timbers. Yep, Silas roared. Jeb, where are you? A weak cry came from a small tack room door on the side of the barn, one that was miraculously not yet fully engulfed. Here, legs pinned. Beam came down. Silas ran toward the sound, grabbing a discarded axe on the way. Two of the older hands followed him without hesitation. Alara stood frozen for a half-second, the horror of the scene washing over her. The barn held their winter feed, their tack, their tools. It held their future, and it was turning to ash before her eyes. Thorn had created an impossible choice. Save the man, or save the assets. Save a life, or save a livelihood. But for Silas, it was not a choice at all. He did not even glance at the terrified, valuable cattle being driven away into the darkness. He did not spare a thought for the tons of hay, the embodiment of his financial security, that were fueling the inferno. His entire focus was on the small door and the man trapped behind it. That was the moment Alara's last wall crumbled, not with a crack, but in a sudden, silent implosion. This man, this quiet, principled man, would burn his future to the ground to save one of his own. Her fight was his fight. His fight was hers. There was no longer any distinction. She ran to the well, her mind clear and cold. She started working the pump, her arms straining, filling bucket after bucket. Other hands, the ones not working with the cattle, saw what she was doing and formed a line, a desperate, futile brigade against a sea of fire. It was not about saving the barn anymore. It was about buying Silas time. She could see them now, three figures silhouetted against the flames, hacking at the wall of the tack room. The wood was thick, the smoke was choking. Finally, they broke through. Silas, and one of the hands disappeared into the smoke-filled opening. Time stretched, became elastic. Every second was an eternity. The roar of the fire was the only sound in the universe. Then they were out. Silas and the other man were supporting Jeb between them, his face pale with pain, his clothes smoldering. They dragged him away from the collapsing structure just as the main roof gave way with a deafening crash, sending a volcano of sparks and fire into the heavens. They laid Jeb on the ground a safe distance away. Alara rushed to him with water and clean cloths she had grabbed from the house. His leg was broken, a nasty compound fracture, but he was alive. He was breathing. Silas stood and watched the barn burn. He watched his legacy, his security, his future turn into a column of black smoke against the dawn that was just beginning to break. His face was covered in soot. His shirt was torn, but he stood tall. He had made his choice. He had not hesitated. He had won, and he had lost everything. The next day, the lawyer came. He was a man from town, a man in Thorn's pocket, his face a mask of false sympathy. He served Silas the papers with a sad shake of his head. Foreclosure. Thorn, as Silas had predicted, had bought the note on the ranch from the bank. With the destruction of the barn and the loss of the winter feed, Silas was in default. The ranch was, for all intents and purposes, already gone. The matter was to be settled at a county hearing in 2 days' time. A formality, the lawyer assured them. When he was gone, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. The hands moved like ghosts, their faces hollow. Jeb was laid up in his bunk, his legs splinted, his mood as foul as his pain. Silas stood on the porch of the house, looking at the smoking, blackened skeleton of his barn. Alara came and stood beside him. "It's not over," she said. He looked at her, a flicker of his old fire in his tired eyes. "Alara, I have nothing left." "He's won. He's won the battle," she corrected him. "Not the war. He thinks he's beaten you with fire. We're going to beat him with ink." She held up the ledger. Her ledger. The true one. The county hearing was held in the town hall, the same building that overlooked the plaza where she had been sold. The room was packed. Every rancher, every merchant, every gossip and town elder was there. It was the same audience that had watched her humiliation. They had come for the final act of another drama, the fall of the Croft Ranch. Alara sat beside Silas at a small table at the front. She wore her only other dress, a simple gray wool, mended and clean. She had her ledger, her maps, and a sheaf of papers held together with string. Her hands were steady in her lap. Marcus Thorne sat at the opposing table, flanked by his lawyer. He looked confident, relaxed. He was the picture of success, of inevitable victory. He nodded to people in the crowd, a benevolent lord accepting the fealty of his subjects. He did not spare Alara or Silas a glance. They were already ghosts to him. The hearing was presided over by a county commissioner, a man named Hayes. He was old, stern, and reputed to be fair, but he was also a man who respected wealth and power. Thorne's lawyer laid out the case simply and brutally. Silas Croft was in default on his loan, now held by Marcus Thorne. The ranch had suffered a catastrophic loss of assets. He was unable to meet his obligations. The foreclosure was a sad but necessary legal procedure. It was clean. It was simple. It was on the surface irrefutable. Commissioner Hayes turned to their table. "Mr. Croft, do you have a response?" Silas stood. He looked at the commissioner, then at the crowd. "I do," he said, his voice clear and strong, "but it is not my response to give." He sat down and looked at Alara. A murmur went through the room. All eyes turned to her. The cook, the fat girl from the auction. Thorne smirked. This was better than he could have hoped. Letting a woman, and this woman at that, speak for him? Croft really had lost his mind. Alara stood. Her heart was a hammering drum against her ribs, but she pushed the fear down. She walked to the commissioner's table and laid her ledger and her papers upon it. "Commissioner Hayes," she began, her voice quiet but carrying in the silent room. "The matter before you is not a simple default. It is the final act of a decade-long criminal conspiracy." Thorne's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is absurd. She has no standing." "Sit down, counselor," Hayes said, his eyes on Alara. "Let her speak." Alara did not use emotion. She did not speak of fires or betrayal. She spoke of numbers. She opened the ledger. "For 10 years," she said, "the Croft Ranch has been systematically defrauded. I have documented over 200 separate instances of fraudulent billing from a feed supplier whose orders were placed by Mr. Thorne." She pushed a stack of papers forward. "These are copies of the invoices and a sworn statement from the supplier, who has admitted to kicking back a portion of the overpayments to Mr. Thorne." A gasp went through the crowd. "For 10 years," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "the Croft Ranch has lost cattle at a rate inconsistent with natural predation. These losses always occurred near the border with the Thorne Ranch. We have statements from 2 of Mr. Thorne's former hands, who have confessed to rebranding Croft cattle under his direction." She slid another document across the table. Thorne's face had lost its relaxed smile. He was staring at her, his eyes cold with fury. "And the water," she said, unrolling one of the old maps. "The drought that so crippled the Croft Ranch this year was not entirely an act of God. It was exacerbated by a geological anomaly that diverted the main creek, an anomaly that funneled the water directly onto Mr. Thorne's land. An anomaly that Mr. Thorne, whose grandfather commissioned this faulty survey, surely knew about. He waited for a dry year to profit from it. She had laid the foundation. Now, she built the final wall. Mr. Thorne did not cause the fire. We cannot prove that, but he created the conditions for it. He bled this ranch to the point where one crisis, one fire, would be enough to break it. And he positioned himself to be the sole beneficiary by secretly purchasing the loan." She looked directly at Thorne. This was never about a loan. This was about theft. Grand, patient, methodical theft. The room was utterly still. Thorne could feel the tide of public opinion turning against him. He could see it in the faces of the crowd, the people whose respect he had cultivated for years. They were looking at him with doubt, with suspicion. He lost his composure. He stood up, his face a mask of rage, and pointed a trembling finger at Alara. "This is an outrage," he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "To be subjected to the insane ramblings of this fat, penniless heifer that Croft dragged out of the gutter. She has no name, no standing, no right to speak on matters of business and property. She is nothing." The ugly words, filled with vitriol and contempt, echoed in the silent hall. Alara did not flinch. She just looked at him, and she smiled. A small, sad, triumphant smile. He had done it. He had done exactly what she knew he would. In his arrogance, in his underestimation of her, he had shown everyone in the room exactly who he was. He had confirmed every accusation she had made, not with evidence, but with the poison of his own character. Commissioner Hayes banged his gavel. "That is enough, Mr. Thorne." His voice was like chips of ice. He looked at Thorne with utter disgust. Then he looked at Alara and at the mountain of evidence she had built. In light of this testimony and these documents, Hayes declared, his voice ringing with authority, "This foreclosure proceeding is hereby stayed. Furthermore, I am referring this entire matter to the territorial sheriff for a full criminal investigation into the activities of Mr. Marcus Thorne." The sheriff, a large man who had been standing at the back of the room, began to walk toward Thorne's table. Thorne collapsed into his chair, his face ash white. He was ruined. And then a sound began at the back of the room. It was a single person clapping, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room, the entire town, had erupted in thunderous applause. It was not for Silas. It was not for the saving of a ranch. It was for her. Alara stood there, stunned, as the sound of their approval washed over her. It was the polar opposite of the laughter that had greeted her in the plaza. It was a sound of respect, of vindication. She felt a hand on the small of her back. It was Silas. He was standing beside her, a silent, solid pillar of support. He was not trying to take her moment. He was simply anchoring her in it. She looked out at the faces in the crowd. They were smiling at her. They were nodding. In their eyes, she was no longer the fat girl, the auction piece, the curse. She was the woman who had faced down Marcus Thorne with nothing but the truth in a book of numbers. She was a legend. The days that followed were a blur of quiet rebuilding. Thorne was arrested, his empire of deceit crumbling under the weight of the investigation Alara had started. The town, in a complete reversal, now treated the Croft Ranch with a kind of reverent respect. Offers of help came pouring in. Men from neighboring ranches, the same men who had whispered and judged, showed up with lumber to help rebuild the barn. The women from town arrived with pies and casseroles, their offerings a silent apology. Alara accepted it all with a quiet grace, but she kept a polite distance. She had not fought for their approval. She had fought for her home. One evening, a week after the hearing, Silas found her on the porch. The sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows over the valley. The frame of the new barn was already rising against the sky, a skeleton of hope. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the colors change. Then Silas cleared his throat. He was holding a folded piece of paper. He looked nervous. "Alara," he began, his voice a little rough. He held the paper out to her. "This is for you." She took it. It was a legal document. A deed. She read it, her eyes widening. He was deeding her a full half of the ranch. The southern pastures, the ones with the best water, the ones she had saved. Her name was there, in clear, bold letters. Alara. Not Alara Croft. Just Alara. "I don't understand," she whispered, looking up at him. "This is not a gift," he said, his voice firm, his gaze steady. "A gift implies you haven't earned it. You have. This ranch would be dust and memories without you. This is your share, your rightful portion." He took a breath. "I want to be clear. This is not a proposal of marriage. I'm not trying to buy you or bind you. I am asking you to stay. As a partner. An equal partner in this place." He looked out at the land, his land, and now her land. "This is your home," he said quietly. "If you choose it." She looked down at the deed in her hands. She thought of the auction, of the feeling of being worthless, of being property. She thought of the cold alley and the vow she had made. Never again trust another. She had been wrong. Trust was not the weakness. Trusting the wrong people was the weakness. She looked at Silas, at his honest, tired face, at the quiet strength in his eyes. He was not offering her a cage, no matter how gilded. He was offering her a foundation on which to build her own life alongside his. He was offering her a choice, and she was finally free to make it. "I choose it," she said, her voice clear and strong. A slow smile spread across his face, the same smile she had seen in the barn, the one that reached his eyes. It was a smile of profound relief and quiet joy. She folded the deed and held it to her chest. It was not just paper. It was her future, a future she had forged herself with her mind, her courage, and her two capable hands. She had come to this place a piece of property, a discarded object. She was now its foundation. As the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the hills, they stood there together, side by side, partners. The silence between them was no longer one of caution or uncertainty. It was a silence of peace, of shared purpose. Silas reached out, his large, calloused hand finding hers. He didn't say a word. He just held it. His touch was not a claim of ownership. It was an acknowledgement. It was a promise of all the sunrises to come. And for the first time in her life, Elara felt completely, irrevocably home.